for this paper. We'll go do another one if I can find something. Jeez, I had so much trouble finding a paper. But yeah, so let's go back and we'll go look. Let me put a little stream marker down right there. Okay, go back to Firefox. Okay, so this one was number 1. And now we'll go to number 2. 228. Put that here. There we go. Alright. Synthes. Look at them. I'm just looking at all these journals. They must be putting a whole bunch of stuff out this week. Couldn't find anything that to read in them, though. You have one in mind? Send it over. Bioethics is fun, yes. Like, philosophy of biology, just in general, is a lot of fun. What? Oh, this is What is Deflationism About Truth. Did I think I have that one right here. So, because, and it's available. So, yeah, Cryonics, send something over, and I will take a look at it. Yeah, see, I actually had this this other bioethics like saved here, more a problem for full ectogenesis. And I'm sorry, Andrew Bailey. I've read stuff by Andrew M. Bailey before, and it's good stuff. But this paper is just too long. I was looking at generic animalism before, but I can't read a 30-page paper. Moral experimental. All right, let's just moral. All right, let's just click on Don Loeb. You don't have the link? Yeah, I'm looking for it. What's ectogenesis? That is, having baby in like a pod. Like, so you have an artificial womb, and the baby grows outside of a woman, basically. Let's see. Moral incoherentism. Let's see. Well, it's not showing up here. We've got experimental philosophy. Let's do a full search. Do more coherentism? No. Don Loeb's moral incoherent. Okay, so we've got something on Reddit. Let's see if we got a link on the Reddits too. Aha, here we go. Moral incoherentism, how to pull a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. In Moral Psychology, 2008. So this looks like a chapter. That's my question, lol. Let's see if this is here. Okay. Oh my god, this is like long. Oh wait, is that just it? Okay, so it looks like there is a doc file. Let me try and get a hold of it. I don't know if it's gonna work. I haven't used this in a while, so that's just my problem. Okay, just so you know, this is showing up at 70 pages. 70 pages is not generally what I like to... oh dear, this is all busted. I haven't used this in a while. Okay, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so... 70 pages. I mean, do you want me to go over the... I can go over like the first like 15 to 20 pages of this, but that means I'm not even going to get through... I mean, is this your reading group stuff? Like, even though the text is big, like, I can't really get through more than that in the next like hour or two. But if you'd like to go over that, we can try and do it. So... Yeah, see, most people don't realize how long philosophy is. It can be very, very long, which is too bad. But I was happy it was available at least. Hey, Bubble Bloop, what's up? You know what? Let's go give it like a few minutes, and we'll see what it is. And then if it doesn't, I mean, I've only been streaming, 40 minutes. I can do something else. All right, so let's just go take a quick look at this moral incoherentism. How to pull a rabbit out of a semantic hat. Actually gonna go eat dinner, but I'll probably be back. Cool. Well, thanks for stopping by, even if it's just a drive-by. I met Don Loeb and he thought was a smartass. You were a smartass, or you thought he was a smartass? That's, I guess, the real question there. Okay. Come, let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. You were a smartass, okay. Well, were you? I don't know. I mean, or was he just being silly? I have no idea. So this is, I guess, a quote from when the people were building the Tower of Babel to reach God, and so God came down, confounded their language, that they may not understand each other. At least I think that is what that's from. It seems a truism that the way we think and talk can have no bearing on the metaphysical structure of the world. So we're immediately starting off with the contingency and conventionalism of language. So this is not a truism. It's basically been long assumed, but it may seem that way. But maybe this is going to go against that. In particular, whether there are or fail to be any real moral properties would seem to have nothing to do with the semantics of moral language. But like many apparent truisms, the one about moral semantics contains only part of the truth. It is true that whatever properties exist do so whether we talk about them or not. All right, so we've got a real world now. So it's not that there is things are not relative to what we say. There is some sort of things that exist. They exist in reality. It's not just up to us and what we say. But those properties are indeed the moral properties, if and only if they're the properties we are talking about when we talk about morality. So now it's trying to get relative to what we say about it. This is not to say that if we were to change the way we talk, we would thereby change the metaphysical structure of the universe. If we decide to call chairs tables, they would still be chairs. You see, I'm not entirely sure this makes sense. Like, you're saying something and you're assuming it's a table. You're assuming a chair is still a chair, and then you're calling it a table. Then they'd still be chairs, but then it would just be tables in that world. There would still be tables then. So it's like exactly what the point of this sort of sentence is a little hard to decipher already. But the truth of the previous sentence depends... Okay, so this is fine. But the truth of the previous sentence depends on what we use the word chair and table to talk about now. Yeah, see, I don't like this because this is a bait and switch right here, but that's fine. Similarly, whether there is such a thing as, for example, moral rightness depends on whether there is any of whatever it is. If anything, we use the word rightness to talk about now. Thus, an investigation into the semantics of moral language, construed broadly to mean questions of meaning and or reference, is a crucial element in our search for a resolution of one of the central issues of metaethics, whether or not moral properties are real. I don't know if I buy any of this, but fine. Like, it's we're using the philosophy of language to go look at how to get at moral properties, and maybe that works. I don't know. We shall see. The claim that moral language is relevant to metaethical inquiry is not new. What is not often appreciated, however, is that the matter to be investigated consists largely of empirical questions. In saying this, I do not mean to claim that empirical science can easily discover the answers, or even to presuppose that the answers can be uncovered at all. That remains to be seen. But an inquiry into what, if anything, we are talking about when we employ the moral vocabulary must at least begin with an inquiry into the intuitions, patterns of thinking and speaking, semantic commitments, and other internal states, conscious or not, of those who employ it. So this is a real empirical version. You see, but we've already going with what we are talking about when we employ moral vocabulary must at least begin into an inquiry into the intuitions. Why? Because we say it's moral, but what if we're wrong about that? And then it's like, well, of course, then how do we fix what we're talking about? Like what he was just saying up here. Depends on whether there is anything that we use the word rightness to talk about now. Yeah, but who cares what we talk about now? Don't you, like, that would make it sort of a relative thing. And I thought this was supposed to get at something bigger than like what we're just talking about now. Anywho, whatever. Okay. Although not everyone would be comfortable with the phrase, I'll loosely refer to the internal states as our linguistic dispositions. In the metaethical context, we must begin with the linguistic dispositions, including dispositions to revise our linguistic practices upon reflection that are relevant to fixing the reference, if any, of the terms in the moral vocabulary. Philosophers' a priori speculations, doubtless heavily influenced by philosophical theory, or a posteriori generalization based mostly upon encounters with undergraduates, might be relevant to such an inquiry, but they cannot be the whole of it. Such speculation and unscientific sampling are no substitute for careful and philosophically informed interpersonal, and cross-cultural anthropological and psychological inquiry. So, what are we doing here then? Are we doing sociology or anthropology? I don't know. One dispute, especially in need of settling, involves two prominent hypotheses, each of which claims to capture the essential features of moral thought and discourse. All right, so I guess let me pause here. This is like a chapter in a book or something. It's like 70 pages, well, like 30 pages because it's kind of double spaced. But you can see this is not like the other papers I've been reading. This is like, all right, let's just talk about some big ideas for a while. Yeah, experimental philosophy, it looks like it's going there. But look, this is like, okay, let's talk about some very big abstract stuff. And then, you know, they're sort of like working their way into what they kind of want to get to. So it's not like your normal paperwork just says like, boom, here's what we're doing. This is more like, oh, this is screwed up. I just realized. There we go. This is sort of like easing our way into what they want to say because they have a lot more space. This isn't trying to, you know, compress for a journal. This is basically, you know, we have all the time in the world and we're going to get around to what we want to say. And so the strategy of the writing here is completely different from that little short paper where it was just like boom, 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 boom. This is like the stuff we're going to talk about. This instead is a, let's just sort of like, you know, let's talk about this over here. Then we're going to go over there. And, you know, it's kind of like all these little things. And we're just going to get where the author wants to go. So it's a completely different sort of writing style here. We're just going to mention one dispute now, as opposed to like, say this is what the argument is. All right, continuing. One dispute, especially in need of settling, involves two prominent hypotheses, each of which claims to capture the essential features of moral thought and discourse. Moral cognitivism holds that moral sentences make factual claims, or slightly more formally, that they express propositions, the bearers of truth value. Moral non-cognitivism, at least in its traditional forms, hold that moral sentences do not make factual claims. Instead, they express something other than propositions, emotions, imperatives, attitudes, or the acceptance of norms, for example. Yeah, so basically when you say you think something's immoral under the non-cognitive version, it's saying you don't like it. It's saying it's expressing how you feel about your emotions. I'm interested in it because moral incoherentism is a unique position as far as I know. Okay, I have no idea what moral incoherentism is, but I mean, it might be this moral non-cognitivism right here. If you're just expressing your emotion, it doesn't have to be coherent. Or maybe your emotions have to be coherent, but they don't actually have to be logically sound as if you're making factual claims about the world. Or maybe what is going to happen is oppositely, it's going to be a cognitivist approach, moral cognitivism, but it's not going to be coherent propositions. So I don't know. We'll see what this incoherentism is, or at least I hope we'll find out what it is. And yeah, everyone else feel free to ask questions too. So just because, I'm happy to read this because Cryonics was interested, but everyone else, please ask away. A cognitivist need not deny that moral utterances serve these expressive functions in addition to making factual claims, but the views are still in conflict since non-cognitivists, traditionally at least, deny that moral sentences make factual assertions at all. The non-cognitivists are asserting something about how they feel. It has nothing to do with how the world actually is. At least that's one version that I've heard in the past. And that's what the emotions are, or imperatives, attitudes. Yeah, it's your attitude towards the world. And so that doesn't have to be a true or false statement. A proposal along either of these lines is not an invitation to use moral language in the specified way, but rather a hypothesis about the way moral language is used by people in general. It is this feature that makes resolution of dispute in principle subject to philosophically informed empirical investigation. I completely disagree with this last sentence. I don't see why this feature of anything has to do with asking people about how they feel about it. Asking people how they feel about it does not mean that people are going to answer in the right way. Just because I feel like I'm expressing emotion doesn't mean I'm not also talking about a state of the world. Or if I think I'm talking about a state of the world, that doesn't mean I'm not just talking about how I feel about things. Nowadays, you can see in the political disputes, people are telling you all the time the way they say the world is, and mostly they're just telling you how they feel about stuff. I mean, it's completely the idea that we can actually look into this. I very skeptical right here. Okay. No account can expect to... Alright, let's get the question first. It's kind of about how the truth of moral statements can be determined by experimental philosophy, because philosophers in the past have sought to verify moral statements under ideal conditions which are unrealistic situations. Okay, I mean, again, the proof is in the pudding. We have to see how it's going to go about here. I just don't even think that you can... I don't know what sort of question you can ask in terms of a scientific hypothesis that you can put forward to actually resolve this sort of thing. Because anything that you do ask a person about what they're doing, how do you actually know that those people are getting their themselves right? So, alright, but that's fine. I mean, I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again, and we'll see what this author has to say. Okay, no account can expect to capture everyone's linguistic dispositions for all cases, of course. An account of moral semantics is meant to represent what is being thought and said in ordinary circumstances by ordinary thinkers and speakers. But ordinary people can be confused in where they are. We might want to tighten things up a bit. For these reasons, both cognitivists and non-cognitivists are often prepared to recognize that any account of moral thought and language will involve some degree of idealization. Some would even go so far as following what Richard Brandt called the method of reforming definitions. Brandt there. This was just, move the parenthesis. But although idealization is a matter of degree, there is a crucial difference between an appropriate idealization and a reform. The reformer seeks to find the analysis that best explains our linguistic behavior, despite the idiosyncrasies of our actual speech and thought. The latter merely changes the subject. Okay. Yeah, see, this is a problem. Now you're starting to, massage people's opinions into certain, camps. And it's how much massaging are you doing? Are you reforming it, or are you just sort of trying to figure it out? Brandt himself rejected what he called the appeal to linguistic intuitions to answer questions in moral philosophy on the grounds that normative terms are too vague, that there is no reason to think that there is any language-wide single meaning for these terms, that they may well embody confusing distinctions or fail to make distinctions it is important to make, and that the locutions of ordinary language are not always well adapted to say what, on reflection, we want to say, or to raise questions which on reflection we want to raise. But the fact that an appeal to linguistic intuitions would show vagueness, confusion, conflict, and flawed thinking supports the hypothesis that our ordinary moral talk is confused, and hence is evidence that on reflection we would not all want to raise the same questions. However confused our current moral language is, reforming it simply changes the subject, if there was ever even a subject to begin with. Indeed, the move to reforming definition often presupposes irrealism with respect to the reference of the original terms. Yeah, see, if you want to say you're reforming it, then you're getting away from the ordinary language to begin with. And so once you're getting away from the ordinary language, then you're not doing ordinary language philosophy, and you don't actually know if you're getting what the people are saying correctly. Because then you've moved yourself into a more philosophical like situation. Okay. But recognizing that a reforming definition is changing the subject raises an important worry. Suppose that no coherent account would fit our linguistic dispositions well enough to count as the real meanings of the terms in the moral vocabulary. What? I mean, coherent according to what? Like what everyone would say? I mean, I can tell you right now that there is no coherent account of everything anyone ever anywhere says about moral stuff. I mean, there's no way we're all going to be coherent if you're talking about what we all think in terms of moral psychology. I mean, of course, there is no coherent account. That would be crazy if everyone all of a sudden agreed on what moral psychology was and moral vocabulary was. Anyway, so I'm not sure what's going on here. Suppose that is that any coherent account would involve changing the subject in some way, some important way or ways. If so, then it seems to follow that there are no particular things, properties, etc. we are referring to when we employ the terms of that vocabulary. There's any coherent would involve changing the subject. Then okay, so then if we change it, then using the original terms actually doesn't refer to anything. A simple analogy can help us see one way in which such semantic incoherence can lead to irrealism. Both roundness and squareness are central to any proper understanding of the phrase round square. An analysis that is left either element out would amount to a serious reform. But given that both are present in any proper analysis, there can be no such thing as a round square. Semantic analysis, together with an uncontroversial logical premise, has led us to conclude that nothing in the world could actually be a round square. Depends on your logic, of course. This is not uncontroversial, depending on what logician you're talking to. So, but yeah, most classical logicians would not say round squares on the most common understanding of things. But there are ways around this too. Moral semantics is, of course, much more complicated than this. The debate between cognitivists and non-cognitivists is one example of the ways in which it is less tractable than the analysis of round square. Yeah, I mean, if they're talking past each other, then that's kind of something too. I mean, I think that's all this all goes to show is that, people are getting talked past. If one person says when we say something moral, it's about something in the world, and the other person says, no, it's just expressing how you feel about stuff, and then they're arguing, well, you're not going to get them talking to each other because you aren't talking about the same thing at all. It's like, how do you feel versus the factual state of the universe? Okay. Nevertheless, I will argue the persistence of such a fundamental dispute about moral semantics is evidence that inconsistent elements, in particular commitments to and against objectivity, may be part of any accurate understanding of the central moral terms as well. Okay, so the author here looks like they're taking the fact that you can talk about it in both ways, a fact about how moral terms work. The fact that you can talk about how you feel and how it could be about in the world, that is a fact about moral terms, that they can apply in two different ways. So this person is just trying to, split the baby, have it both ways. This is way above my level of for semantics. All right, let me try and break it down a little bit better then. Basically, there's two ways that in this area that they talk about. Either you're talking about something in the world, or they're talking about how you feel about the world. So it's like, all right, here we go. Pencil. Now, if I call this a pencil, am I talking about a fact in the world that this is a pencil, or am I talking about how I feel about it? Like, I feel like this is a pencil. Now, for things like pencils, you'd be like, no, you're talking about the way the world is, that is a pencil. But for things that are like, that's fair. If you're not a semantics person, then this is going to be very hard. But if you want to talk about like a moral thing and you say, well, that's bad, then you might be saying, look, that's just like your opinion, man, that you feel bad about that. That's not actually bad. Because if you say, look, let's say, okay, turning around 3 times counterclockwise is bad. And I was like, well, I don't think that's bad. You think that's bad. That's how you feel. They say, no, it's an objective fact in the world that turning around 3 times counterclockwise is bad. And so that's what it is. Like in these moral statements, it says, well, look, that's just how you feel about, like, that's your opinion, your emotion, your disposition, but that doesn't actually have anything to do with the world. So it's like they're trying to say it's somewhat different than like the factual claim that this is a pencil. So the author here is saying, look, that's just how morals are. It is both. It is how you feel, and it is about the world, and this ambiguity is part of it. So maybe part of any accurate understanding is that your commitments to both to and against objectivity. So it's a little bit of an unusual claim to go both ways on this. Okay. Let me know if like that made any sense anyway. Alternatively, it could be that there is incoherence at a higher level, that there is so much confusion and diversity with respect to the linguistic disposition surrounding our use of moral vocabulary that does not make sense to think of our moral senses as making any particular assertions or expressing any particular attitudes. Alright, so we're not even going to say that it's something about the world or how you feel. It's just nonsense based. Well, not nonsense, but you can't even figure out what you're talking about when you're saying moral stuff. If the moral vocabulary is best understood as semantically incoherent, the metaphysical implication is that with respect to that vocabulary, there is nothing in particular to be a realist about, no properties, that count as the reference of the moral terms. I call the hypothesis that the moral vocabulary contains enough semantic incoherence to undermine the moral realism in this way, moral incoherentism. If moral incoherentism is correct, then we can indeed pull a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. I don't know what this means down here, but I mean, if you're just going to say that there is no way to make sense of moral talk, and that's kind of what the semantics is. What does it mean? And this author is saying there is nothing. There's no properties as can count as the referent of moral terms. There is nothing. A referent is something out in the world. There is nothing either in the world or in you, like in terms of your opinion, that those things, there's nothing to be realist about, that it's not really your opinion. Then that's what the author is calling moral incoherentism. And if moral incoherentism is correct, well, I don't know what this, then we can pull anything out of anywhere, because I don't know what you can do with that. Isn't math a semantics too then? Syntax, man, this is hard to digest. Okay, yes. When you get to the interpreting the meaning of math is fine. Is like a different thing, but yeah, once you get to like logic and math, you can also run this stuff too, and they do. Cranix says, in other words, the way we use language can determine the truth of moral statements. That is kind of what is going on here, Cryonics. But the author is kind of saying more than that, saying, look, it's not just the way we use language, it's that the way we're using language is so confused. And it's so confused, they're taking a metaphysical lesson than that, and saying, look, it's so confused that we're just going to assume the confusion is fundamental, and we're going to call all moral talk incoherent, and that therefore we have moral incoherentism, because there is nothing that we are referring to anymore, not in the world and not in you in terms of like your emotions. Yeah, I wouldn't worry, DeMarshall, if you haven't done like formal semantics, I wouldn't worry about the semantics of math and what that's referring to, because if you're going to talk about like Platonic stuff, then you're referring to like the forms. Otherwise, there's plenty of other things. Like if you think math is in our heads, then you're referring to like how we all think about math, those sort of things. So that gets very, very complicated. I wouldn't put too much into it. At least not. I wouldn't try to figure that out without like doing some background reading. That's a big topic on its own. All right, so here's what we're going to do. This is pulling a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. And then in what follows, I will argue that there is reason to take this odd possibility seriously, and that the only way to see whether it is correct will require sophisticated, philosophically informed empirical research. You are moral incoherent then. Well, just because it doesn't make any sense doesn't make this guy right. No, that's not unfair. That's completely unfair. Yeah, moral incoherent, fine. You think the moral talk doesn't make sense, then maybe you should like what this author is saying. In Section 2, I offer an explanation and partial defense of moral incoherentism. In Sections 3 and 4, I turn to Frank Jackson's recent work on the connections between semantics, metaphysics, and ethics. While sympathetic with much of what Jackson has to say, I argue that he fails to take the importance of systematic empirical research sufficiently seriously, and that he fails to take the possibility of moral semantic incoherence sufficiently seriously as well. In Section 5, I argue that little actually depends on whether we accept Jackson's controversial approach to semantics. The empirical issues are roughly the same as on any reasonable approach. I close in Section 6 by pointing out some of the pitfalls presented by the sort of research I claim is necessary. Looks like more perspective, and I sound like it. Okay, well, that's good. If you like the perspectivism. I don't know if this is perspectivism or... This is like a metaphysically sort of like higher level thing than I think just perspectivism. I think it's saying, look, you can't make any sense. It's incoherent. And so I don't quite know what this incoherence comes to, but like it might come down to perspectivism. It might not, but I just don't know yet. Okay. First, however, I turn to the recent history of metaethics in order to further illustrate what I mean by pulling a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. Yes, please, because I have no idea what that meant. Moore and Ayer, a lesson from the recent history of philosophy. Okay. Like I said, please ask questions. I don't know for how much we are, just so you guys know, because I don't think you can't see on the bottom of the page. We are on page 9 of 70 right now. 9. So, I mean, we're not getting past probably 20. Ayer is worth something after all. Ayer is worth a few things. I mean, I don't know how much, but worth something. And you don't know, Ayer may just be a punching bag here for all you know. G.E. Moore began his great work, Principia Ethica, with a stern and seemingly sensible warning. It appears to me that in ethics, as in all other philosophical studies, the difficulties and disagreements of which its history is so full are mainly due to a very simple cause, namely to the attempt to answer questions without first discovering precisely what question it is which you desire to answer. At all events, philosophers are constantly endeavoring to prove that yes or no will answer questions as to which neither answer is correct, owing to the fact that what they have before their mind is not one question, but several, to some of which the true answer is no, to others yes. Ironically, Moore seems to have committed the very error he warned against when he put forward the famous open question argument. Take any property we might be tempted to identify with moral goodness, pleasure, for example. Still, the question can reasonably be asked whether something having that property, something pleasurable in our example, is indeed good. Thus, pleasure and goodness must not be the same thing. In contrast, it is not an open question whether something that is a three-sided, enclosed, two-dimensional figure is a triangle. Thus, such figures are triangles. Okay. I don't know if you want to reductio Moore that quickly, but fine. Moore is widely thought to have conflated two questions, one semantic and one metaphysical. Asking which question appears open might be a way of testing to see whether the word goodness means the same thing as the word pleasure, though most of us would agree that it's not a very good test. Yeah, I'm not sure about any of this stuff at the moment. I'm losing it. But we'll see. But even if it were a perfect test, it couldn't tell us anything about the nature of goodness itself. Famously, it could be, and at least at one time at least was, an open question in the relevant sense of whether water is H2O, but water itself is H2O in any event. By looking into the meaning of goodness, Moore tried to support the claim that the property of goodness is not identical to any natural property. In running semantic and metaphysical questions together in this way, we might say Moore tried unsuccessfully to put a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. Yeah, you see, this is one... Yes and no. I mean, exactly what Moore was up to is kind of hard because it's like looking back with a... later 20th century glasses on what Moore was up to. Maybe this is fair to Moore. I don't know if it is. I feel a little bit like what Moore knew what he was doing, and so I'm not sure that this is completely fair. It seems a little quick, but I'm not an expert on this, and the author is probably right, but I feel kind of uncomfortable. That's all right, though. But now consider A.J. Ayer's non-cognitivist account of moral semantics. The analysis is doubtless incorrect as it stands, but let us suppose, for argument's sake, that it is correct. Moral sentences, we are assuming, do not make factual claims at all, and thus do not express propositions, the bearers of truth values. Instead, they are used merely to express emotions or to issue commands. If this is so, then statements like, "it is wrong to cheat in school," simply do not make factual claims. They cannot be true or false. They are, on Ayer's view, cognitively meaningless. Yeah. I mean, that's just saying, cheating bad. I mean, and that's it in terms of how you feel about it. More is a mixed bag. Yeah, I like some things and more, but it's, when people be like, "Oh, this old philosopher made this obvious mistake," it's like, nah, usually they didn't. I mean, I feel, I guess I should say, taking cheap shots at old philosophers, I don't find to be particularly compelling. So, it seems reasonable to treat anyone who denies sentences like "it is wrong to cheat in school" are ever true as a moral irrealist, even if he also denies that such statements are ever false. But we needn't get into the taxonomical issue here. The important point is that on the assumption that Ayer's moral semantics is correct, he has managed to do exactly what Moore failed to do. He has pulled a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat, for he has shown that a correct understanding of the meaning of moral sentences shows moral realism to be untenable. Okay, but I mean, that's a big assumption here. It's like, if you assume it's correct, then you get the exact answer that you were expecting, but we don't assume that's correct. Like, it's a big if, like over here, on the assumption. So, I mean, again, I feel like this is using the old philosophers as like cudgels to say, hey, look, Moore got it wrong and Ayer got it right on the assumption of these views. So, kind of funky. Anyway, I'm probably wrong about that stuff, but a little bit. Yo, Bubble Bloop, welcome back. We are reading this, we're reading some of this. Moral Incoherentism, basically talking about basically the idea of moral incoherentism. We're going to get to it real quick, but like, it's just saying, look, all of our moral talk is just so confused that that is how it is. It is inherently confused. It is morals are inherently incoherent. And so we have to sort of deal with that now. That morals are incoherent. Not that you can make sense of them, because there is nothing to make sense of. Alright, so that's what we're kind of doing. Although almost no one takes Ayer's arguments for non-cognitivism seriously these days, non-cognitivists' approach to moral semantics have remained well represented. Yeah, that's true. These approaches typically emphasize the endorsing, commending, or as I shall call them, prescriptive function of moral statements. But despite this focus on the prescriptive features, there is often a significant effort among non-cognitivists to capture certain objective-seeming features of our moral thought, discourse, practice, and experience as well. Thus, for example, Alan Gibbard claims that we take our moral statements to involve a commitment to what he calls standpoint-independent validity. Roughly, when I make moral statements, I express my acceptance of norms that I take to apply even in circumstances in which those subjects to my moral appraisals do not themselves accept the norms I'm expressing, including hypothetical cases in which I myself am being appraised. If I were to change my mind, I think, I would be making a mistake. But to think this is merely to accept a norm whose application has broad scope in the way just described. So it's like, if you're saying cheating is bad, it's not just telling you how you feel, but you're just like sort of saying everyone should feel the same way about how cheating is. It's not that it's a fact, but saying that everyone should feel the way I feel about cheating. In contrast, cognitivists understand moral statements to be straightforward statements of fact. They point out that this seems to fit nicely with the surface grammar of those statements and to capture in a more natural way the objective-seeming features contemporary non-cognitivists are at such pains to accommodate, such as the possibility of erroneous moral beliefs, our seeming recognition of moral demands, and the existence of moral disagreement. It is often thought that the cognitivist theories have trouble accommodating the prescriptive, commending, or motivational features of moral thought and language, and that non-cognitivist theories have a leg up in this regard. But cognitivists will often try to show that their approach can indeed accommodate the most important aspects of this family of features. We're fresh out of necessary connections between moral considerations and reasons or motives for action, the cognitivist often seems to be saying, but we're running a special on strong contingent connections of that sort. Okay, so when you're expressing like something that would be what an emotion would be, and you're not talking about things in the world, you're talking about contingent facts. So yes, you aren't talking about how you feel about things anymore under the cognitivist viewpoint. So you're not talking about that you feel something is bad, but you're saying there's a lot of contingent facts that come around with something being bad in the world, and those include the sort of emotions and dispositions that the non-cognitivist, the emotivist, is claiming. So it looks like both sides want to have their cake and eat it too. So, yeah. Cognitivism and non-cognitivism, as I have characterized them, are in direct conflict with one another. The persistence of this conflict requires explanation. Why hasn't one view of moral language come to dominate? An obvious answer is that each of these theories captures something important about our moral thought and language. We are committed to both objectivity and prescriptivity. Thus, each side begins with a certain advantage owing to its apparent facility for accommodating either the objectivity or the prescriptivity commitment, and then does what it can to address the other. The top contenders among current theories do a good job of accommodating our concerns about both objectivity, that's talking about the world, and prescriptivity is talking about how everyone should feel. The claim that both objectivity and prescriptivity are essential features of moral thought and therefore of moral language was central to one version of J.L. Mackey's famous argument from queerness. Mackey thought that no moral theory could adequately accommodate both elements. That is one reason why he held an error theory of morality. A proper analysis of moral sentences incorporates both elements, he thought, but nothing in the world could correspond to what that analysis says we should be looking for. Moral statements are indeed factual assertions, he claimed, but statements like abortion is permissible or abortion is morally wrong are always false. Mackey was surely correct in thinking that some sort of commitment to both objectivity and prescriptivity is built into our moral thought and talk. But the appeal of non-cognitivism is not fully explained by its allegedly greater facility with the prescriptive elements of moral thought and language. If paradigmatic forms of non-cognitivism are incompatible with moral realism, then it is reasonable to think that this incompatibility, far from being seen as a problem, was and is welcome in at least some non-cognitivist quarters. Cryonics says, J.L. Mackey, the philosopher who moral realists will talk about until the end of time. I believe Cryonics is correct. Continuing. For a theory according to which moral language is not used to make factual assertions is plausible only if we assume that ordinary people do not think the realm that they are talking about is a realm of fact. As Mackey himself argued regarding subjectivism, according to which moral sentences state facts about the speaker. It is because subjectivists have assumed that there are no objective values that they have looked elsewhere for an analysis of what moral statements might mean and have settled upon subjective reports. Indeed, if all of our moral statements were such subjective reports, it would follow that, at least so far as we were aware, there are no objective values. If we were aware of them, we would say something about them. Yeah. As is true for subjectivism, non-cognitivism's anti-objectivist implications explain much of its appeal, at least for those who find it appealing. Yeah, so if you want to go this way, this is the way you go, but okay. Mackey himself took the anti-objectivist implication of subjectivism and non-cognitivism as evidence that these theories were inadequate accounts of the meaning of moral statements, since those implications seem incompatible with the objectivist strand in ordinary moral thought. But in doing so, he overlooked a possibility even more radical than one envisioned by his argument from queerness. Perhaps side by side with the objectivist strand in ordinary moral thought is a more broadly anti-objectivist strand. On this hypothesis, one important reason for the continued appeal of core forms of non-cognitivism, those according to which moral language is not used to make factual assertions, is that there is a powerful strand of everyday moral thought according to which morality is not a realm of fact. Okay, so it's just saying, all right, we're not talking about facts, and this is an everyday thought, that we're not talking about facts when we're talking about morals. I mean, this is an empirical statement right here, that we're not talking about the world when we're talking about morals. We're talking about something else. So I don't know about this claim, actually, because just because Mackey said something, that's fine, but this is a further claim by this author that it is an everyday moral thought where we're not talking about facts. I don't know if people think about that enough to actually have to make this claim. Okay, anyway. The objectivist anti-objectivist distinction cuts across the more familiar realist and irrealist and cognitivist non-cognitivist divides. On the objectivist side are the moral realism, Kantianism, and most forms of constructivism, and perhaps even certain sophisticated forms of non-cognitivism. On the anti-objectivist side are the error theory and traditional emotivisms like Ayers. There is a sense in which relativism and subjectivism do acknowledge the existence of moral facts about what is morally permissible, etc., around here, or about what any given individual happens to approve of. But both theories are inconsistent with a more robustly objectivist strand in ordinary thought that holds that there is a non-relative set of moral facts, a strand whose widespread appeal is not in question. Is this culturally relative that people think maybe in the West that there's a non-relative set of moral facts? I don't know that this is actually something. This might just be a Western tradition that we think there's facts in the heart. Maybe some other culture doesn't think so like this. I don't know. Because relativism and subjectivism assume that there are no non-relative moral facts, I will treat them as anti-objectivist, reserving the term objectivist for views according to which there are only non-relative moral facts, albeit facts having different applications for different circumstances. Fine. No doubt the anti-objectivist strand does not typically reflect any well-worked-out meta-ethical position on the part of non-philosophers. Yeah, see, this is what I was worried about above. There's no well-worked-out this stuff because that would imply that it wasn't an everyday thought in some sense. So it's like inherently it's not going to be well-worked out, but it's kind of hard to claim that then it's an everyday position also. But most people do recognize the distinction between realms of fact and realms in which there are no facts. Is there more than one inhabited planet? Ask a question of fact. Which is better, chocolate or vanilla? Does not. Yeah, so now we're getting into questions of taste. And people, this is sort of a hot topic, I think, in philosophy, is talking about taste. The former concerns a realm about which ordinary people are, at least implicitly, objectivists, and the latter is a realm about which they are anti-objectivists. It is reasonable to suppose that we use our words to make factual assertions, perhaps among other things, in roughly those cases in which we believe that we are talking about a realm of fact and do something inconsistent with the making of factual assertions when we think that we are not talking about a realm of fact. Yeah, so if I say, no, chocolate is better than vanilla, you might look at me a little weird because that's sort of a question of taste. Some people like chocolate more, some people like vanilla more. And if I was just going to say, well, that's a fact that chocolate is better than vanilla, you'd say that's not the sort of thing we're saying is an objective fact. It's a matter of how people feel about it or their particular taste. And so to call it a fact would be mistaken. Yeah, proving too much. Mackey was right to say that if ordinary people see morality as a realm of fact, then it would be surprising for them not to use the moral words to make claims about that supposed realm. But the converse is also true. If ordinary people see morality as something other than a realm of fact, it would be surprising to see them using their moral words to talk about such a realm. And indeed, it is unlikely that they would be using their moral words to talk about anything. What? You see, I don't know why it would be unlikely for them to talk about anything. If they're not talking about fact, it might be talking about like, well, if it just means I like this better, like I like chocolate better than vanilla. And I'm not even saying I do, I'm just saying that chocolate and vanilla are good things to argue about in terms of taste. And I'm not sure, there's no consensus with philosophers, but I mean, there's no consensus about what people are saying. And I don't see why anything here would be surprising. I mean, the way people use their words may just be sort of metaphysical fads, how people talk about stuff. I'm not sure there's anything we can really read off of contemporary language. Anyway, there is certainly no consensus among philosophers about whether morality is a realm of fact. However, philosophers' views on hotly disputed meta-ethical questions are hardly dispositive concerning what ordinary people are using their words to do. But what if ordinary people are themselves often deeply conflicted, both interpersonally and intrapersonally, on the question of moral objectivity? Again, it is reasonable to suppose that the moral language would reflect that division. Would it? I don't know why it's reasonable. They would say stuff, but where would you actually go looking in the moral language to find this? You could go looking for it where you thought it was, but that doesn't actually mean that there's like remnants of this in the language. It doesn't mean that people are actually deeply conflicted. That means that there's a fragment of the language that they use that may not make perfect sense to them or something. But I mean, reading the metaphysics off that is kind of hard. Theories like cognitivism and non-cognitivism attempt to force our moral thought and language into one or the other box, with non-cognitivism typically pushing it into the anti-objectivist box, and cognitivism pushing it into the objectivist box. But the truth may be much more messy and complicated than either theory is capable of handling, at least without violating the constraint against changing the subject. It may be that the order... What do we got? Oh, this is not the right paper, I'm sorry, Kuda. This is... Where was that? Shoot. This is... Where did I find this? Dagnabbit. Alright. Let me get you the paper. That was the last one I read. My apologies, I didn't update the link. Actually, no, this is the wrong thing. Yeah, this is more incoherent. Yeah, see, I'm getting the link here. Get to the... See if I can get the right... I keep getting the pop-up box here. I'm sorry. Hold on. I mean, if you Google this, you're going to get... It's the first thing that pops up. Yeah, so this is the first thing that pops up if you Google it. But, like, I'm going to get one of these incredibly ugly... Oh, here we go. Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay, I think I got it on like fourth time's a charm. So yeah, so we're talking about this. It looks like the author is arguing that since it's so hard to actually separate out what's going on in moral talk, that it's just going to say, look, the moral talk is inherently incoherent, and what do you do once the moral talk is inherently incoherent? So it's by Don Loeb apparently, and this is 70 pages, so I'm going to get through as much of it as I can right now, but I ain't getting through all 70. Okay. But the truth may be much more messy and complicated than either theory is capable of handling, at least without violating the constraints against changing the subject. It may be that ordinary people use the moral words both to make factual assertions and to do something incompatible with the making of such assertions, because ordinary people are at bottom widely, irremediably, if perhaps only implicitly, conflicted about questions of moral objectivity. This conflict. I mean, are you guys all out there so conflicted about this? Like, any people in chat, are you like hardcore conflicted about your the objectivity of moral language? Like, was that what you were thinking about all day, all week? It's like we can do a little experimental philosophy right here. Let's see. Ooh, never done this before. Poll. See what happens. I've never done a poll before. Let's see what we like. You guys have 1 minute to answer that. It's for channel points? Oh, that's right. My apologies if like you don't have any, but I've never done a poll, so it seems like fun. Okay. That there is indeed a strong objectivist strand in the way ordinary people think about morality is virtually uncontroversial. Yeah, people do think they're saying, look, there is a right and a wrong. And that's supposed to be answered no, but don't worry. Don't worry, I won't worry about it. But although it is often downplayed or treated as merely superficial, there is evidence of a fairly robust anti-objectivist strand as well. Almost anyone who has taught philosophy has encountered this anti-objectivist strand frequently on students. Alright, so never. Yeah, so this is not what people are thinking about. So the fact that you're deeply conflicted is just... It's a hard thing to... Like, I just find that the author needs that claim for this paper. Because if you want to motivate saying that... we need to study this, you need to say, well, people are conflicted, we have to find out how they are conflicted. But if everyone's not even thinking about this, it's still worth looking into. But it seems like a weird thing that maybe asking people how they feel about it might not be the right thing to do. Okay, almost anyone who has taught philosophy has encountered this anti-objectivist strand frequently among students, because that's like just like your opinion, man. When asked about metaethics, a number of them say things that suggest a commitment to either moral relativism or to the view that morality is not a realm of fact at all. I will have more to say soon about whether we should take this strand in ordinary thought seriously, but prima facie, at least, we seem to be presented with commitments both to and against moral objectivity. And again, it would be surprising if these apparently powerful strands in ordinary moral thought were not reflected in the meanings of our moral words. Yeah, there's definitely people on both sides of the divide. I mean, no one's damn kids in their continental philosophy. Yeah, but like, people be like, well, that's just like your opinion, man. That's exactly what this is. It's like, this is real, dude. And you can just like, this is what I feel about stuff. It's like, yeah, those are crappy arguments, but like, it does exist. Okay. But how could they be? An account according to which we use moral language both to make non-relative factual assertions and to talk in a way that assumes there to be no such facts or only relative facts would reveal incoherence in our moral talk. Isn't that in itself grounds for rejecting any such analysis? I see no reason to think that it must be. We are trying to discover what it is people are actually using or trying to use the moral words to do. The answer depends on people's actual linguistic dispositions and not on what makes things look uncomplicated. As we saw, an analysis of the phrase round square would be incomplete if it didn't reveal incoherence. It is worth knowing whether our moral terms build in incoherence of this or any other form as well, however concealed from us it is in ordinary contexts. So look, this author is trying to say, look, we have to go investigate this because people say two different things, and we want to go find out if what we say is really incoherent. I just find this funky. Why can't we just say the world has more than one thing in it? Like, oh my God, it might have facts and it might also have dispositions. And the fact that our moral theories don't cover both of them all the time, this author is trying to make a lot of hay out of it. But, I mean, just because we can use the language in two different ways, maybe we should just not call it all the same sort of moral talk. Maybe we should just make two different terms, and then it's not incoherent anymore because we're talking about two different things. Yeah. Certainly, interpersonal and cross-cultural incoherence present no objection, since it may be that we are using our words at cross purposes, or not talking to one another at all. The former is possible if there is enough overlap among our linguistic dispositions for it to be useful to employ more vocabulary, even if in important respects we are not talking about the same thing, but surely there is enough overlap. Imagine a die-hard voluntarist arguing with a committed atheist. It is at least possible that, when talking about morality, the voluntarist is talking about the will of God, and the atheist is using the same vocabulary to talk about something else. Even if, unbeknownst to them, the two are really using the words at cross purposes, it is still easy to see how they could continue to talk to one another and to find the language of morality useful in communicating about what to do and coordinating their behavior. Some of the reasoning tools they employ, such as analogy and clarification of the non-moral facts, would undoubtedly be similar enough for something very much like an argument to take place. Both may be committed to trying to do whatever it is that morality turns out to require, and more generally, morality as each understands it may play a very similar role in their lives. Given these commonalities, moral talk would be useful to these individuals even against the backdrop of substantial interpersonal semantic conflict. That is useful to them, however, does not establish that they are, in the end, talking about the same thing. This is this argument sounds real neat and good, that like you can have people that have two very different worldviews talking about what sounds the same, but then if they have different metaphysics, it can't possibly be the same thing. But I wouldn't actually go that far. If they are talking about so much overlap, then the conclusion here that they are not talking about the same thing seems like, well, what exactly were they doing the whole time if it wasn't the same thing? It may be a very similar thing. And then if you're not talking about, in the end, the same thing, what is this end? This is a very strong metaphysical point there. Because if you've got like a very similar like ethical structure for your argument, then maybe you are talking about the exact same thing in a structural sense. Because even though like one of them say, well, morality is based in God, and the atheist says morality is not based in God, so there's like one has God, one does not have God in their argument. So in the end, in that one sense, they may not be talking about the same thing, but if all the rest of it is, maybe this in the end is not the right way of analyzing what counts as being the same thing. So I'm not entirely sure, like this may be a little bit too strong right here. Okay, and I don't think this matters to the arguments, because this whole sort of setup, you have to be careful about. But even intrapersonal conflict is possible. Intrapersonal, not interpersonal, intrapersonal, like inside one person, I guess. Admittedly, it is hard to imagine an ordinary person having in her vocabulary a word like squound, meaning both square and round at the same place and time. But just as it is possible for a person to have inconsistent beliefs, it seems possible for a person to have inconsistent linguistic dispositions as well. As long as our inconsistent beliefs are sufficiently isolated from one another, and we aren't made aware of their contradictory nature, and even sometimes when we are, we can add and indeed do hold them. The same may be true of our linguistic dispositions. Let me introduce all this author and everyone else to these people. They're called dialectists. They have contradictory things that they say are both true and false. There is a huge non-classical literature out there of ways logicians have gotten around having things that apparently are contradictory. So there are a big bunch of people like this that exist. It may not be the majority of people, but there is a huge group of people who have things that are not, that might have a world where there's something square and round. So it's not entirely fair, at least in the philosophy side of things, where things are so cut and dry that you're just saying, well, it's not possible to have these contradictory things. Oh, yes, it is. Oh, yes, it is. So now, if you're going to the average person, they might say it is okay that you have like sort of like emotions that don't always, like, your emotions and how the world is may not always match up. That might be fine. Maybe that is a good argument for dialechism, where you can have contradictory things. But that would not, if you go that way, then you're not going to be able to read off the incoherence of the semantics of this stuff, because you're using a logic that is, well, maybe incoherent or incompatible. Like it just be using a different logic, and so your incoherence would be different. So you can do that sort of thing, but you have to be careful about these things. So, like, this same may be true of our linguistic dispositions. Careful, because if you're coming back to the logic of like square circles, then what's the logic then? If both objectivity and its denial really are central and persistent features of our moral thought, so you're having two things that are incompatible right here, that would have profound implications for the debate over moral realism. Specifically, a form of irrealism would emerge. For if no adequate, coherent moral semantics can be found, then once again there doesn't seem to be anything logically possible anyway, that's classically logically possible, to be realist about. More precisely, nothing can be realist about More precisely, nothing we can be realist about would be entitled to go unqualifiedly go by the name morality, and so with at least many other terms in the moral vocabulary, at least insofar as they build this incoherence. Perhaps we can pull a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat in something like the way Ayer tried to do. Thank you, Valpo. This is a long thing. I don't know how long you've been here, but this is a 70-page thing that was requested by Cryonics. So I'm going to try and get as far through it as I can. But and yeah, Valpo here knows a bunch of philosophy too. So yeah. Cryonics says Loeb is a professor at UVM, which despite its reputation is a shitty school. If UVM is truly a public Ivy school as it is labeled to be, the US is fucked. No one who attends UVM gives much a fuck about learning. It's just a bunch of rich kids from New Jersey. Well, the US is probably fucked. I agree with that. I don't know anything about UVM, so I can't give you anything about that. And that doesn't even mean that Loeb is a bad professor, even if there's a lot of good professors at crap schools. So just because I'm grumpy about stuff doesn't mean this is bad philosophy. In fact, I would argue that my opinion about things is really not a good judge on the opinions of professional philosophers. So, actually, ask Valpo better. I think Valpo is actually a professor. So, but yeah. Just because I have disagreements with things, I am generally a grumpy philosopher. I'm a curmudgeon, although lots of philosophers are curmudgeons also. So just because I'm saying I don't like this, I don't like that, that doesn't make any of this actually bad in an objective sense. This fits with the problem. Okay, I'm from New York. I can completely appreciate crappy people from New Jersey. A lot of great people from New Jersey, but there's plenty of crappy people from New Jersey too, as there is crappy people from all places. So, yeah, if you got all the crappy people, yeah. Well, I'll take Valpo's word for it also. You guys can duke it out about how much you hate New Jersey people. I'm really annoyed about that. I'm really annoyed about this author. Keep using metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. This is annoying me to like no end, because it's like, perhaps you can. It's no, just because you keep bringing it up does not mean you get to do something you want to do, just because you think there's a problem, author. This annoys me, though. Basically, the argument here is that, look, because we can't work out the semantics, we're just going to say the semantics are incoherent, and then we're going to make a metaphysical conclusion about the incoherence of ethics, about meta-ethics. And that's a metaphysical conclusion. I don't know if you can ever do that. You can, if you keep saying that we can't do it, that does not entail a metaphysical conclusion. That's just a negative about what our current capabilities are. Just because we can't figure something out does not mean we have to give up. Now, the author seems to want to give up the ways people are talking about it. That's fine, but you're not, that the conclusion doesn't follow, that you get a metaphysical result out of a negative sort of argument that we can't figure something out. Continuing, and anyone out there, like I said, we got a bunch of viewers. Feel free to ask questions. One of the replies to this literally uses Beavis and Butthead as an example. That's great. You had a professor at UVM who said in the first class that attendance wasn't necessary for the class. Well, I mean, that has to do with school rules usually. I mean, that's kind of terrible though for a philosophy class. Or if it wasn't, whatever. Anyone here? I know people came late. You can always grab the paper if I remember to do it by typing ! paper. And yeah, like I said, feel free to ask questions. It might be objected that as long as some people have a realm of objective fact in mind, morality and the various associated moral properties, in one sense of the word, could still exist. Perhaps there are simply two different senses of the word morality, one of which M1 presupposes a realm of moral fact, and the other of which M2 presupposes that there is no such realm. I think I mentioned this above. Like, you could just split the concept. Okay, yeah. Alright, so yeah, these are just what historical terms. You expected so much more from college, maybe it's your own fault. Sometimes you get some bad luck. You ran into people you shouldn't have run into, things like that. So don't beat yourself up too much. You can always do more now. On this view, we might expect to find that some of us are always using M1, others are always using M2, others are using M1 sometimes and M2 other times. Some have linguistic dispositions which suggest that they are somehow trying to use both at once, and sometimes it is indeterminate which vocabulary a person is using. No doubt people typically haven't noticed that the two meanings exist side by side, so as before they talk and act as if there's only one. But when people are employing the sense M1 sense of the term, nothing in the argument I've made undermines the realism about morality in that sense. Yeah, so if you're talking about objective fact, everyone agrees they're talking about objective fact in that case, then you've got moral realism in that sense when you are all talking about that. Something like the situation just imagined could perhaps be the case, but even if it is so, it would still be true that much of our moral talk is at cross purposes and that the moral words do not have unqualified meanings. Questions like whether moral properties are real or whether a certain action is morally permissible would be ambiguous at best. I don't know, because they just said, like, if you're all talking about that, it's not ambiguous at the time. It's ambiguous from this, like, expanded position that the author's trying to take. So I don't know if this is actually right, because this is from the author's position, not from when people are using it at the time, because when people are using it at the time, there usually isn't a question about if they're trying to be objective, as the author just said right here. More importantly, the more semantic disarray there is of either the incoherence or the ambiguity variety, the less plausible it is to claim that any particular usage represents the meaning of a given term in the moral vocabulary in any important sense. Yeah, this would be a global meaning, like for all time and across time and space. But like, isn't that what we were just saying up here? That like, that's okay? Yeah. The entire university didn't have a philosophy club? Yeah. That's too bad. We can learn how much disarray there is, if at all, only through empirical inquiry. But there is at least some reason to think that there is a good deal of disarray when it comes to the moral vocabulary. Philosophers sometimes dismiss inconvenient features of ordinary people's views as not just erroneous, but as the sort of things the hapless folks wouldn't be caught dead with if they saw things properly. So, to return to our previous example, they assume that if people who think that morality just is what God tells us to do came to believe that there is no God, or came deeply to appreciate the youthful arguments, they'd continue to believe that in an objective morality, just a morality divorced from God. But we have no convincing evidence that this is true. Admittedly, the fact that we appear to believe we are all talking about the same thing is some evidence that we are. Five Circle says, is that generally true in the US? UK universities pride themselves quite a lot on their clubs and societies. I went, the schools I was at, they had philosophy clubs. So, I mean, I just don't know. For all you know, it was there, it got dissolved. I just can't even tell you, like, what the situation was while you were there. Sometimes you have to go looking a little harder than you want to, though. But yeah, I wouldn't say it was generally true in the U.S. 5 circles. And welcome, by the way. The fact that we believe we are all talking about the same thing is some evidence that we are. Maybe. Alright, continuing. But the claim that God is the author of morality is undoubtedly so central to some people's use of the term morality as to be non-negotiable, in the sense that those people would stop using the term rather than give up their disposition to use it in this way. If so, and if those people became convinced that there is no God, such people would have to abandon moral realism. Indeed, I have witnessed people asking atheists like me why we refrain from such behavior as stealing or cheating, or asserting that they themselves would have no reason to avoid such conduct if it were not for God's commands. Yeah, that happens, and this is sort of a silly thing, but like, a guy I know died in an accident in the army, and his mom apparently lost like all of her faith in God, and like she was just completely lost. So, yeah, Cuneo is good. Yeah, interesting. I don't know this stuff, because I'm not an ethics person, so I don't actually know Cuneo. The professors weren't the problem, they were great. Okay. Yeah, you see, there's a lot of weird things going on in U.S. universities. So the UVM professors may have been good, but you may have had like a funding problem, and so all the clubs lost their funding. I had to go in front of, we had to go justify our funding at my university when I was a kid, because when I was in school, because, like, it was just, they made it a little too hard to get funding for your club. And we got our funding, but it was kind of crappy in the end. It was really fun. We actually had this girl had a sob story. She actually started crying in front of like the board that was deciding these things, and they were just like, "Okay, you got your money, just leave." For one of my clubs, she was like, "This is the only place that would have me." Like, oh God, and she was serious. She felt really bad. A lot of schools have organization, not always academic programs. Some have, but not others. Psychology was a strong club. We just started philosophy one last year. Yeah, this is the thing. U.S. universities they vary in their focus a lot of times, and so you have to. Some people have a strong history of this sort of thing. Other people, as Valpo said, you just start it, and sometimes it gets picked up quick. Sometimes it dies out. You don't always know. So. My philosophy club was our sociology club lunch. Yeah, see, exactly. Where's the funding coming from? Let me tell you that story real quick. I did a little jiu-jitsu when I was in college, so I was in the jiu-jitsu club, but we had like a wrestling team, but we had no women's wrestling team, and so there were some women in college who wanted to wrestle, and they went to the wrestling coach and said, "Look, there's no women's wrestling team. Can you at least like make some space so we could practice with the team?" And the coach said basically to them, "Fuck off." It's like, I don't ever want to see you again. And so they ended up in the jiu-jitsu club because we were the only people that would wrestle with, we were willing to wrestle with girls, basically, and women. So we had a few female members, and they were really happy because, we treated them well, and like they were happy to be there, and they were good wrestlers. And so we were doing jiu-jitsu, but like the wrestling translated over. So yeah, but I was no good at jiu-jitsu. So yeah, again, like I said, I agree, somewhat dependent on extracurricular activity of the department themselves. Yeah, it's just varied here, 5 circles. So yeah, I did some martial arts when I was younger. I do Tai Chi now mostly, which is a martial art. Okay. Yeah, these people would have to abandon moral realism again if they believe in God, and they tie their moral realism to God, and there is no God, then they lose their moral realism. So, but yeah, that was the example of like, people can lose what they believe. It can happen. It's rather devastating and sad, to tell you the truth, when it happens to people. This sort of like seemed like just like, why aren't you atheists like stealing all the time is sort of frivolous, but like if religious people lose their faith, it's rather damaging. Anyway, Furthermore, it is not just the disputes among the various forms of objectivism and anti-objectivism that should worry those who assume that the moral words have definite, coherent meanings. Again, how definite are we talking about here? Other terms in the moral vocabulary proper might present problems similar to those encountered in metaethical contexts. Right, the word, might simply and non-negotiably mean different things to those with consequentialist leanings than to those with deontological, virtue-theoretic, or feminist ones. In fact, any irresolvable apparent moral disagreement would be some evidence that those appearing to disagree are not talking about the same thing. But what? What? This is all a philosophy. Let's just throw up our hands and be like, oh my god, everyone's arguing, so therefore everything's incoherent. I mean, that's like a reductio of this whole argument that, this is why I'm not even saying this is a bad argument. I'm just saying that this is a bad argument for this author to be making here, because again, this is way too strong. It's way too strong because it makes it look like any disagreement here now is an argument for incoherence. And so I don't like that the author used this argument at this time, and in this place. Again, the facts that we often seem to think we are talking about the same thing is some evidence that we are. But non-negotiable conflict of the sort I have just described here is evidence that we are not. Just how much conflict of this non-negotiable sort exists is still an open question, but if there's enough of it, then even the limited sort of realism described above is in trouble. Okay, so yeah, if there's too much argument, therefore realism is in trouble, I would be a little more cynical. Just because we have no understanding of something right now does not mean that we won't in the future, and that it doesn't even mean that someone in the argument is right. It's just that the rest of us are idiots. That's all it means. And I'm perfectly okay with 99% of us being idiots. Okay, hey, well, thanks for stopping by. Go get some sleep. I hope you get some good sleep. Yeah. 4:50 in the morning, you're in Europe probably. Have a good rest, and I hope you have an excellent day tomorrow. Or later today, as it were. Oh yeah, if you guys want, I have a Discord. I have a YouTube also. Feel free to, do the follow thing here. If you want notifications, I read philosophy and play Minesweeper, basically. So... And just so you guys know, I'm on page 27. Maybe we'll get to page 35, so we'll get halfway through this. I'm going to try to, at least. Would a metaethical stance resting on a claim of incoherence or multiple incompatible meanings be an error theory like Mackey's? Perhaps, in an attenuated sense it would, since there is something erroneous in being confused over what we are talking about when we speak about morality. But moral incoherentism is, in a crucial respect, very much unlike the error theory, for it denies that moral utterances are factual assertions. Thus it makes more sense to treat it as an entirely new variety of moral irrealism. Traditionally, moral irrealists have been forced to choose between non-cognitivism and the error theory, leaving aside relativism and subjectivism, anti-objectivist theories, which may or may not be thought of as versions of moral realism. Moral incoherence is a form of moral irrealism that denies the semantic assumptions behind both of the traditional forms. Whether or not it is correct remains to be seen, and, as I have suggested, philosophically informed empirical study of people's metaethical views and linguistic dispositions is necessary if we are to uncover the truth. Cryonics forever says, I knew someone who minored in philosophy and had to take a semester off because he was so frustrated by UVM. They always say the student population at UVM has gone from hippies to hipsters. Yeah, see, I don't know anything about the student population. That's kind of funny, though. My brother keeps trying to make me into more of a hipster. I just resist. I'm not actually a hipster. It's too bad. I probably would do better as a hipster. Too grumpy. Most philosophers, Mackey included, have based their claims about moral thought and language on thought experiments and introspection, though Mackey also made reference to the history of philosophical thought and to the thinking of ordinary people. It is rare, however, to see any serious empirical inquiry into these questions. One philosopher who claims to recognize the importance of empirical inquiry into moral semantics, however, is Frank Jackson. But although I am sympathetic with many features of Jackson's approach, I think he is wrong to ignore evidence supporting moral incoherentism. In the next two sections, I explore his position and ask why he does so. Part of the answer, I argue, is that he has not taken the empirical nature of these issues seriously enough. Okay, so now we're going to move into an actual positive view of this incoherentist position of Jackson's. Alright, like I said, I'll try to get a few more, like another 7 pages. Hitting the 2-hour mark. Although in many ways far apart in substance, from Metaphysics to Ethics 98 is a manifesto of what is sometimes called the Canberra Plan, or sometimes just the Plan. In much the same way that Language, Truth, and Logic was a manifesto of logical positivism. A central element of the plan's approach involves conceptual analysis, the purpose of which is to define the subject, to discover what it is we are talking about when we use a given vocabulary. You gotta go, bye! Are you streaming tonight or no, Bubba Bloop? Bye, Bubba Bloop. I don't think you are, it's not one of your nights. And I hope your dog feels better. No, okay, cool. I mean, sometimes I try to stay up, but you're killing me at 1 a.m. sometimes. Have a great night. There we go. Much better. You guys can check out Bubba Bloop. Bubba Bloop streams a lot of fitness and Minesweeper. All around good guy. And he does some other variety streams too. It's fun. May your dog live forever. Yeah, his dog wasn't feeling great the other night. Metaphysicians will not get very far with questions like, are there K's? Are K's nothing over and above J's? And is the K way the world is fully determined by the J way the world is, in the absence of some conception of what counts as a K and what counts as a J? I mean, you just want to like kill people when they write sentences like this sometimes, though. It's like, this is like grounds for murder. Although metaphysics is concerned with figuring out what there is, we must first figure out what it is we are looking for when we ask our questions in the terms given by a particular vocabulary. Really? Maybe. To do that, we must come to understand the concepts behind our words. If we do not understand these concepts, Jackson argues, we risk talking past one another or simply changing the subject. Alright, so you have to agree on what you're talking about. Yeah. Our concepts then are what guide us in using our words to cover certain cases and not others. They are not tied to any particular language, and while schnee and snow are almost certainly stand for the same concept, a word like socialism may stand for one thing in the mouth of a typical American, but stand for something very different when uttered by a typical British voter. However, how we use our language is, in a sense, up to us, Jackson thinks. Indeed, he refers approvingly to Humpty Dumpty's dictum that words can mean whatever we wish for them to mean. The pretty clear implication, I think, is a kind of semantic individualism. You got your concept and I've got mine. But Jackson doesn't think that is such bad news because he believes that there is actually a good deal of overlap in our concepts. As we saw, this shouldn't be surprising given the way we use our words to communicate with one another. There is your concept of rightness and my concept of rightness, Jackson thinks, but there is also a common concept of rightness, a folk concept shared by most users of a given language and perhaps others as well. It is folk concepts like these that we are often interested in when we ask the sorts of questions philosophers ask, Jackson says. More generally, there is folk morality, the network of moral opinions, intuitions, principles, and concepts whose mastery is part and parcel of having a sense of what is right and wrong and being able to engage in meaningful debate about what ought to be done. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty reasonable position right there. Like, I might feel a certain way, you might feel another way, but then there is like some sort of common core that overlaps between what we both think is like generally what is the common morality. And when you get outside of the common morality, then you get to have like more a personal opinion. But then it's like when I say murder's wrong, you say murder's wrong. That's the core of it, and like basically we're agreeing on everything that there is right there. Clearly, we do not simply make moral judgments at random. There is some pattern, often largely unknown to us, to the moral judgments we make. Thus, there must be something, no matter how hard to identify, guiding our use of words. What? We just went from moral judgments to guiding the use of words. I assume they just mean moral talk. But, I mean, just this sentence here is a little too strong. And just as a continuing, and just as a grammarian might uncover the hidden but principled structure of classificatory practices that do not often involve the conscious application of known rules, we might hope to uncover, through a conceptual analysis, the implicit theory behind our use of any given term. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole basis of a lot of stuff, is that there's secret things behind what we do and we can figure it out. But I mean, it's kind of an odd thing too. Do you actually follow rules when you're doing grammar? This is a Wittgensteinian point. Or is it something else? Like, you can describe how we speak using grammar, but are we actually following the rules of grammar? Like, is that what we're doing? Like, oh, this is the rule, we have to follow it to express our point? So this is not, even though this seems like a very uncontroversial thing going here, this may actually get things backwards, depending on your view of how semantics work, or how grammar works. Okay. Jackson is not using the word theory in any ordinary sense. Humpty Dumpty was right, remember? What he means by theory, he tells us, is simply a commonality or a projectable pattern to the cases where a given term applies. A theory needn't be conscious, accessible, explanatory, or anything beyond what is needed to account for a person's use of a given vocabulary. Alright, let's call this a model, actually. Not a theory, but a model. It will almost surely involve some borderline cases, and there is nothing in this notion of a theory, he says, that is incompatible with a causal or historical approach to the reference for some terms, or with our being committed to using a word in a way that defers to whatever the best scientific theory would say, or to divisions in nature worth marking. Yeah, so I mean, it could track the world in some way. The task of discovering the theories or concepts behind our words is an empirical one, Jackson notes. I mean, if you want to call it a model, that's how I'm thinking about it. It's like, so there's some model behind our words, and we're referring back to like how we sort of view the world in this sort of like abstract way, the way the ethical model would be, moral model. The method of discovery is the method of possible cases, wherein we consult people's intuitions about what would count as appropriate uses of the term whose concepts we are seeking to understand. Intuitions about how various cases, including various merely possible cases, are correctly described in terms of free action, determinism, and belief are precisely what reveal our ordinary conceptions of free action, determinism, and belief. For what guides me in describing an action as free is revealed by my intuitions about what various possible cases are or are not cases of free action. So we've got intuition theory here. Yeah. If we want to know what a person using a particular term is talking about, we need to understand the concept behind their use of the term. To find out, we must ask the person questions about whether the term is correctly applied in a range of possible cases. You know, it's slightly different. You can find this out, but is that actually going to get you the intuition, or is it going to find you a range? It'll get you something close, I guess. But we can't simply accept people's initial answers to those questions. We need to correct for any distortions caused by confused thinking and the like. A person's first up response as to whether, let's say 33 of 70, yeesh. A person's first up response to whether something counts as a K may well need to be discounted. One or more of the theoretical role they give K hood, evidence concerning the other cases they count as instances of K, signs of confused thinking on their part, cases where the classification is, on examination, a derivative one. They say it's a K because it's obviously a J, and they think defeasibly that any J is a K. Their readiness to back off under questioning and the like can justify rejecting a subject's first up classification as revealing their concept of K hood. We want to know what really is within the scope of people's concepts and not merely what they treat as within their concept's scope at first blush. Interestingly, just as we refine our first up responses to questions aimed at eliciting the scope of our concepts, we also subject our initial responses to questions about morality to a similar process of refinement. So this is no longer ordinary folk talk. This is refined folk talk. So this is what refinement is. I mean, you got to be careful when you do this stuff because it's not folk morality, it's refined folk morality. Folk morality, we are told, is currently under negotiation. Its basic principles and even many of its derived ones are a matter of debate and are evolving as we argue about what to do. Through such evolution, we hope to move from our current moral theory to a mature one. Mature folk morality is the best we can do by way of making good sense of the raft of sometimes conflicting intuitions about particular cases and general principles that make up current folk morality. If Rawls was right, it is the morality that would emerge in what we might call ideal reflective equilibrium. Jackson himself believes that the limit of moral inquiry there would be widespread convergence, so that it makes sense to talk of mature folk morality simpliciter rather than this or of that community's mature folk morality. Indeed, he says it is part of our current folk morality that convergence will or would occur. But he recognized that both he and current folk morality could be wrong about this, and if so, he is prepared to accept the relativistic implications. Although Jackson's description of the way those seeking to clarify people's concepts must correct for people's initial responses is somewhat vague, it seems clear that many aspects of the correction process will coincide with those involved in the correcting of our moral beliefs, the ordinary methods of moral reasoning, minimizing the impact of confused thinking, and testing to see how firmly intuitions are held, for example. Both processes involved refining people's intuitions about whether a range of possible cases involves morally right action and the like. Indeed, some of the negotiation towards mature folk morality Jackson has in mind can reasonably be understood involve debates over the correct application of terms like right, virtuous, or blameworthy. Alright, so this is page 36. Now, how much more of this do I got? Okay, let's get down to at least the end of the section on page 37. So, cool. The library at UVM is terrible as well. They didn't even have the second volume of Schopenhauer's WWR. I'll stop complaining now. Yeah, academic libraries are funky like that sometimes. Like, why don't they have Schopenhauer? Yeah. Academic libraries, I don't know. Hopefully they have what you want, but thankfully nowadays you can get things from other places. Okay. Furthermore, the motivations for understanding our concepts and for getting into ideal reflective equilibrium have at least one common thread. For even now, if we often use our words to talk about things, some of whose contours are not yet clear to us. Thus, when a person attributes a property like rightness to something, in this case an act, the person is typically saying that the act has the property of rightness, not as she currently believes it to be, but as it really is, or at least as she would see it if she were thinking without any error or confusion. In many cases, our concepts already commit us to some form of idealization or correction of our initial intuitive responses. Like, this is always the case, though. I mean, we're never going to be perfect. So it's like, I'm not sure what extra is going on here, but it's like, that's okay. I mean, there's very little that we are perfectly describing perfectly accurately all the time. So, but if the distinction between current and mature folk morality is to be maintained, it seems that there must be two different sorts of correction processes, or at least significant differences of degree. Jackson has not told us how to differentiate between the sort of corrections or changes to our intuitive responses needed to understand current folk morality and the sort needed to arrive at mature folk morality. Until he does so, it is not clear what, according to his theory, people are talking about when they use the moral vocabulary now. And unless he can find some reasonably principled way of drawing the line, his distinction between current and mature folk morality appears to collapse. Yeah, people love the Schopenhauer too. At least some people do. More generally, and perhaps more importantly, Jackson hasn't given us a way to distinguish between refining our understanding of a concept by adjusting our understanding of that concept's scope to better reflect people's actual linguistic dispositions and changing the subject. With regard to morality, he hasn't given us a way to distinguish between refining our understanding of our moral concepts and changing our concepts in the manner of reforming definitions. We'll see in the next section that there are other serious problems associated with Jackson's claim about the need for correcting our initial intuitions. Okay, so we're now at like the halfway point, probably more than halfway. I just want to say I don't really care about this author beating up on Jackson, to tell you the truth. Like, that's fine. I'm sure the author is using it to get to where the author wants to go, which seems like a long way off at the moment. So this is all Jackson being wrong here that I'm scrolling through. Now on page 50, Jackson is still wrong. So we've got 13 full pages of Jackson being wrong. Okay. So now we're going to semantic approaches more generally, and there's only 18 pages left. Let's take a look at what else we actually have left, because there might be like 15 pages of notes. Schopenhauer is everything. That's nice, cryonics. Kant is a great philosopher. Hinduism is a great religion. Kant plus Hinduism equals Schopenhauer. I've never heard that before. That's kind of fun. Let's just see. Alright, so we've got problems for semantics. So this might be starting to get into criticisms of it, and then we've got the conclusion. Yeah, so, okay, 62. And then we're on to notes. So it's really only 62 pages. So what time is it? I've been going it's midnight here. All right, let's see if we can get into this semantic theory stuff, not Jackson's. Okay, so we're going to skip the Jackson section because that went on for like 15 pages. Why stuff. And then we finally get to the positive view here. Let's see if I can do this for a few minutes without losing my mind. What counts as a correct semantics of morality seems to depend on what counts to be a correct approach to semantics at a much more general level. Thus, although questions about moral language are largely empirical, this is another respect in which they cannot be wholly so. How can we know what to look for if we have not settled the question of whether a broadly internalist or descriptivist approach or a broadly externalist or causal approach to reference is correct? Indeed, don't we need to decide on a particular version of any of these approaches before we can figure out how to see whether moral incoherentism is correct? Unfortunately, there is no consensus on which, if any, the many going approaches to semantics is right, and even less consensus about how to put these approaches into practice in any but the simplest cases. But that doesn't mean that the project of reaching empirically sound conclusions about moral semantics is doomed until we have made a good deal more progress in the philosophy of language. In fact, I think we needn't be so fine-grained to start off. Roughly the same information will be relevant no matter which semantic approach we decide to take. To see why, we need to take a brief look at the most prominent of the available options. Yeah, I don't like this. That's okay if I don't like it, but that's like the author has already tied their approach to saying the semantics, and then they're saying we don't know what the semantics is. But then can't we just run the exact same argument again? We've got two different things, and the two things are at odds. Therefore, we should be semantic incoherentists. And then we're just crap out of luck. But like, the fact that we can talk about it and the same stuff will be relevant, well, that was the same thing in the ethical case. So it's like, yeah, doesn't seem like the author is playing fair here. Continuing. The more traditional philosophical approach to questions of semantics looks a lot like Jackson's. It is internalist or descriptivist. On this view, very roughly, meaning and reference are at first a personal matter. What a person is talking about, according to this approach, is whatever corresponds to the speaker's own understanding of the term. Thus, each of us can ask a question like, is moral rightness real in his or her own personal idiolect? By moral rightness, I mean the property of maximizing the overall net expected ratio of pleasure over suffering. Given the alternatives open to an agent, then there is moral rightness just in case there is something corresponding to that particular description. This is descriptivism, really. How, then, is communication possible? It is possible, as we have seen, if we share definitions that are more or less equivalent. This is the descriptivist Frege-Russell theory of reference. So is there common questions we are all asking when we ask whether there are facts about moral rightness? That depends on whether our conceptions of moral rightness agree, at least in their essential features. You guys can argue about Hume. That depends on whether our conceptions of moral rightness agree, at least in their essential features. But while some would argue that each individual can know his or her own conception of rightness or of any other property or identity by introspection, whether there is agreement among any number of us is an empirical matter, one that can be addressed only by investigating the linguistic dispositions of those engaged in the discussion. I don't know if that's the only way to do it, but yeah, you can go ask everyone if how much they agree with each other. More recently, externalist semantic theories have gained wide, though by no means universal, acceptance. One family of such theories focuses on the causal histories underlying our use of the words in question. This is Millianism. The causal histories goes back to Mill. On one prominent version, when we talk about water, we are talking about the stuff causal contact with which, by seeing, tasting, etc., is responsible for our use of the word. Nice to see someone standing can't. I ended up doing so because few would in my grad department. A few moral realists would defend an anti-rationalist. Yeah. Responsible for our use of the word. Likewise, rightness is whatever it is that is causally regulating our use of the term rightness. On this approach, semantic questions do not reduce to what individual language users believe about the nature of moral rightness, nor even to what they would believe if free from error. Indeed, one of the advertised advantages of the causal approach is its ability to accommodate widespread and serious disagreement about the nature of the entities or properties that any number of people are nevertheless talking about in common. Causal regulation chains are not always straightforward. According to the theory, sometimes, for example, co-reference is said to be achieved by way of deference to experts, which Hilary Putnam has called linguistic division of labor. But whether there is such deference is revealed by our linguistic dispositions. So one set of questions to ask has to do with whether people believe that there are any such experts with respect to morality. These questions could take one of two forms. We might ask people directly whether they believe that there are any such experts, and if so, who the experts are. Or we might ask them questions closer to the normative end of the spectrum, such as whether abortion would be wrong if there were wide agreement amongst certain specified people, like religious leaders, that it was not wrong. Not all reference can involve deference to experts, however, for among other things, the experts cannot be deferring to themselves. Instead, they are often said to be deferring to nature, referring to whatever things have the true nature, whatever it might be, of the things they intend to talk about. Cases in which ordinary speakers are not deferring to experts may have something like this structure as well. In other cases, or in other versions of the theory, it is thought that we defer to those initially choosing to adopt a word to stand for a certain thing, the person who made it up in the beginning. It is hard to believe that this latter sort of deference is involved in regards to central words in the moral vocabulary. You don't want to pick your morals just by who figured something out first. Maybe that person was a bad person. But even if it were, linguistic dispositions of the sort we have been discussing would matter, in this case both the dispositions of those responsible for the initial dubbings and our dispositions to defer or not to their decisions. In all of these cases, we can discover the relevant dispositions, if at all, only with empirical research of roughly the sort I've described here. Really? But okay. You can figure out what the people are talking about by asking them. But then I don't know if that will ever give you the real morals. You can figure out maybe the histories, the causal histories, and who counts as the experts in taking surveys. But that doesn't actually tease out what is the like, you can figure out the initial dubbings and you can see who makes the decisions, but that doesn't give you any understanding of what's actually going on. It's just looking at the history and who counts as an expert. Yeah. A final approach in the broadly externalist camp involves a deference to yet another sort, to the linguistic community as a whole. One version, sometimes called the consensus view, involves a combination of the internalist view with a kind of linguistic democracy. No individual's understanding of what a word means is definitive, but those of the community in general are, and we use words incorrectly when we deviate too far from the community usage. Whether we are disposed to defer to communities in this way and what those communities on the whole believe are once again empirical questions. Valpoes, do you know Linda Zagzebski's moral exemplarism stuff? She's better on this point, I think. I I've seen the name, so I probably have read something about Zagzebski before, because I mean it's a hard name not to notice. I'm not an ethics person. I don't know moral stuff. It's not my area. I just am not up on this. So like I read stuff like this, but you're getting my best guess on these things, but I don't have enough background really. So yeah, on the other hand, do I know the background theories of reference? Yes, I do. I know more about that. So when we're talking about this, I'm like, this is the Millian view. This is the causal history view. Is the Millian view. This is the Frege-Russell descriptivist view, deferring to experts. Like, so I do know those things, because I'm more on the logic language side of stuff and not on the ethics. So it's like I do know something about this, but I don't know how it's been applied to the ethical and moral cases. But feel free to enlighten me. She has a similar move with the Putnam naming reference stuff. I see. Okay. Yeah, so what was the little quote up here? Was it for him? Did I blow by that already? I don't even where to go. It doesn't matter. Okay. Similar move with the Putnam thing. I want to go find that. Where was that Putnam thing? Yeah. Alright. It's already gone. Consensus view. Yeah. I mean, the problem with deferring to the consensus is usually just like, well, then do you ever get to say anything unique? Because if you're always getting pulled back to some mean, is anything new ever going to get said? But yeah, anyway. My life philosophy is basically Advaita Vedanta, well, Whitman, Schopenhauer, and Kant. Okay, sound like good stuff to me. I mean, there's always more. So it's like, those are good. You can read more. You can stick to those. It's fine. On all these approaches, internalist and externalist, what we are using our moral language to do is in large part revealed by our linguistic dispositions, collective or individual. Of course, the route from these data to semantic incoherence is likely to vary from theory to theory, and it's possible that the road will be rougher on some theories than it is on others. But in all cases, we must ask questions designed to elicit a family of related linguistic dispositions. To discover what these dispositions are, if it is possible at all, will require more than introspection and projection or hasty generalization. It will demand a careful empirical study involving a great deal of philosophical sophistication, subtlety, and ingenuity. In the next section, I point to some of the challenges that such an inquiry presents. Well, Whitman and Kant together, fascinating. The former seems more comfortable with the contradictions than the latter. That does seem right. Alright, so what do we got? 58. Oh yeah, I only got to get 4 more pages, so I think I can do that without losing my mind. And I mean, if I lose my mind, I won't be able to tell anyway, so that's your problem, not mine. And yeah, feel free to ask questions if I say something silly. Correct me. Cognitive psychologists and other social scientists, and for that matter some philosophers, have devised empirical tests that are nothing short of ingenious. Yeah, some of us are actually smart. Some of us. Even so, there are special difficulties for anyone contemplating such an enterprise here. To begin, both metaethical and normative dispositions are relevant to moral semantics. So we could ask people whether they believe there are moral facts or whether moral truths are independent of what people believe about them. Or we could ask more indirect questions designed to elicit people's metaethical views. For example, would it still be wrong to commit adultery even if God said it was okay? We could also ask straightforwardly normative questions and try to figure out what would have to be true in order for people's answer to be correct. Presumably, all of these data are relevant to the dispute between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. I mean, to be fair, who is that old king in like the Bible that basically he wanted somebody's wife, so he sent that guy off to war to die? He just like put him on the front line. I forget what the religious position on that act was. But there's definitely a story in the Bible about that. Like, the king was like, you got a hot wife. You are going to the front line. I don't think it was Solomon. I think it was like King David or something. Solomon cut the baby in half. This other one was, it was somebody else, I think, not Solomon. But it was basically, it was like, that I want your wife, and so I can order you to the front line. Yeah, David then. Thank you, Valpo. If moral incoherentism is correct, we can expect to see intrapersonal and interpersonal conflicts, both within and across all of these areas. But since our linguistic dispositions are hardly transparent to us, it is likely that the answers people give will not always accurately reflect their actual psychologies. For example, we might find someone saying that morality is all a matter of taste and not a matter of fact, but then treating many of his or her moral views as if they are factual all the same. But such conflicts, even if widespread, would not be dispositive. For one thing, as we saw in our discussion of Jackson, people are sometimes disposed to defer to their less confused selves. To find out how people would respond if they were thinking as clearly and as thoroughly as possible, however, would itself involve clear and thorough thinking, much of which we can safely assume has not yet been done. Kierkegaard discusses the David story somewhere, so I know that one. Kierkegaard does it. Okie dokie. Furthermore, given the ingenuity of both cognitivist and non-cognitivist attempts to shore up their theories' apparent weaknesses in accommodating what are thought to be the linguistic dispositions built into ordinary moral talk, it is difficult to imagine an instrument capable of giving us the sort of information we need. Suppose, for example, that we want to know whether someone uses a statement like, "It is wrong to kill your children for fun," to express propositions. Simply asking whether such statements are true is insufficient, since it makes perfect sense to say that they are true, according to recent non-cognitivist theories like those put forward by Gibbard, Blackburn, and Timmons. The investigator might push deeper, asking whether the statement is true simply because the agent believes it to be true, or whether instead it is true independent of its being believed. But as we have seen in an account like Gibbard's, in spite of its non-cognitivism, claims to have room for the latter thought. Yeah, so everyone can account for what they don't like, or what their theory is weak on. We might make limited attempts at educating the subject about metaethics. In this vein, I sometimes offer my students a contrast between questions of fact and questions of taste, with like the examples of the inhabited planet and the chocolate, and then ask them whether moral questions are more like the former or more like the latter. But it isn't always easy to get people to understand these issues, and the more explaining we have to do, the less confident we should be that the answers reflect the subject's own views. As seen earlier, this susceptibility to framing and other forms of influence itself illustrates the fragility and inchoate nature of people's linguistic dispositions. King David has a hot relationship with Jonathan in the Book of Samuel. Sounds good. Maybe we should make a movie of that. Finally, when we start to think about cross-cultural investigations involving speakers of different languages, the difficulties of rendering adequate translations loom large. We can't assume that people using the terms treated as synonymous with terms in our moral vocabulary are indeed using them for the same purposes we are. For all these reasons, it is no wonder that philosophers have relied on more informal methods of semantic analysis. But like the drunk searching for his wallet under a streetlight because the light is better there than it was where he dropped it, we cannot expect to succeed if we don't look in the right place. Conclusion. I have argued that empirical semantics is crucial to assessing one of the fundamental issues in metaethics, the debate between cognitivism and non-cognitivism, and I've suggested that resolving this debate might lead to some surprising results, in particular of moral incoherentism, the hypothesis that because of fundamental and irreconcilable inconsistencies in our dispositions with regard to moral discourse, no adequate, coherent moral semantics can be formulated, is correct, then moral realism is in serious trouble. In this way, it might indeed be possible to pull a metaphysical rabbit out of a semantic hat. Whether or not that is the case remains to be established, and I've suggested that it won't be easy, but figuring out how to do it and conducting the relevant research are necessary if we are to discover whether the trick will actually work. Okay. Pleased I got through that in as fast as I did. It was only 62 pages, double space, so we're talking 30 pages, and I skipped about a quarter of it, because that quarter was more criticisms of the alternative theory. So, what's there to say about this? And folks, chime in if you have anything to say. The basic argument was saying that, look, this whole moral incoherentism, because it's fundamental and irreconcilable inconsistencies, which I don't think was... it wasn't badly argued for, but I don't think it was like a knockdown argument in any way, shape, or form, as that we can't figure something out, and therefore it's irreconcilable. then you're supposed to get the metaphysical conclusion, like that's just because we can't figure something out, that's the way it is. I find that a little dubious. I mean, on the logical side, the people who I know who assume are dialethists, they don't think they don't think that, very rarely do they think anything is actually contradictory. They think most things are not. Only very, very rare things. And it has to be a very special reason for that. And why is the moral, ethical, the talk of morals the one time when we get to just throw up our hands and say, this is the way the world is, it is incoherent. And then we have to go look for trying to figure out how that is. So it's like, well, in that case, you're just giving up moral realism. That's fine. But I mean, I don't know if the argument was made appealing to semantics as a strong enough argument for that. Do I take dialectics seriously? I take them very seriously. They're not, I know a bunch of them. They're serious people. And if you actually try to argue against them, it's extremely difficult. They know what they're doing. So, yeah, I take dialectics seriously. And it gets harder and harder to get out of it, actually. They're very, yeah. So, historically, there's always been people who actually believed there's been pretty close to dialethics for a long time too. So it's not even a new idea. It's a pretty old idea. Anyhow, so yeah, what else is there to say? So once you say, look, it is inherently incoherent, because this is like a moral dialethism, even though that's not the right term. This moral incoherentism, and you're saying, well, that's the way it is, and you're saying, well, that's how moral is in the metaphysical sense, so that's how metaethics is. So then you've pulled it out of the hat. But again, I don't see that argument going through. But yeah, if you think that you think that is actually how it is, you're just throwing up your hands, then yeah, you do have to start to contend with moral realism being in serious trouble. Then what the author is suggesting is that you actually could go look to see the evidence of this. But again, how much evidence would it actually take, and of what kind? The author admits, like, it's a real hard problem. Like, how would you actually go about getting enough evidence to say that it is actually irreconcilable? I mean, how do we know it's not just a contemporary fad that we can't figure this out? Because, I mean, things come and go, and sometimes it's not even that it will be irreconcilable, that they can't like figure it out. It's that sometimes these questions just don't seem important in like 100 years from now. It's like, that wasn't the right question, it was a confused question, and it's not an important question. And so the idea that we're going to abandon moral realism over a confused question, that's I guess really where I'm getting at. It's like, this is saying, look, we're not going to make progress in this area anymore. And that seems odd, at least in the area of morals. Now, if you think that this is the end-all be-all, that you have the people on one side that say, look, it's just describing how people feel, and the other side that's saying, no, it's how things are in the world, and that's the end-all be-all of it, and you're not going to ever agree, well, that's a big assumption. Cryonics asks, kind of unrelated, but does dialethism contradict dialectics? No. It depends on, of course, what kind of dialectics you're talking about. If you're talking about Hegelian dialectics, then I definitely don't think it contradicts it. It probably gets along with it. If you're talking about other sorts of dialectics, it depends on it. But like, yeah, I'm pretty sure Hegelians are okay with dialethists. Of course, it depends on the details, but you would have to look at the specific theories. So I don't think dialethism contradicts dialectics, but again, you'd have to look at the specific versions of dialethism and dialectics that you're talking about. But I can tell you that there are people I've seen that basically are okay with both Hegel and contemporary dialethists. Okay, what else is there to say? This is a very long paper for what I didn't feel was like what was this? It was a book chapter, wasn't it? Yeah. So this was something that was allowed to be longer, allowed to take its time. I'm just used to reading research papers, and so I haven't read a book chapter in a while, so I'm not used to this. Okay, but yeah, what was nice about it wasn't like a hard read. Since they had space, it was kind of well written. It was a smooth flow. I liked that. At least I got through a lot of it pretty quick. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have questions. Let me know if you guys got questions, because I actually don't have a whole lot to say. It's like, yeah, don't beat up on people. Like doing this. I did this when I was younger, and I got criticized for it once, and I realized, no, the criticism was right. Don't use someone like more as a punching bag. You can use more as a jumping off point, but don't use more as a punching bag. It's like, oh, Moore did exactly what he said you shouldn't do. You can use this quote if you want to, but you can use it without like beating up on Moore. It's not Moore's fault, all the things that we like criticize him for now. But yeah, otherwise it was actually pretty well written. The structure of the argument here was actually a argument by just sort of overwhelming you. It was trying to go boom, 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 boom. All of these things are hitting the, like, trying to make sense of the different ways we understand the morality, and showing that none of them can work together. So it's trying to go an argument by cases, but it's really not an argument by cases because you don't know all the cases. So it's just an argument by sort of just like a heaping it on. So it's just trying to crush you under the weight of like our lack of understanding, and then trying to pull the rabbit out of the hat by saying you're crushed now and therefore it couldn't possibly work. I don't think that's it's definitely not a knockdown argument. It's just trying to knock you down is what it's doing. So that's the structure of what's going on here. It's trying to knock you down, and then once you're knocked down, it says, like, once you're knocked down in the non-argument way, it's just beaten down. You're trying to beat you down, and then it's trying to get you to accept the conclusion once you're beaten down. And, that's okay, because, frankly, most arguments aren't that great anyway, and this one is like, if it works in this case, that's fine. It could work here, because it could be right. And that same argument is kind of what the dialethists do too. They're saying you're not going to fix this problem, and it's not how it is, and then you move on from there. So in some sense, this is sort of in the same spirit of saying, look, we're not going to get an answer to this question. We've been arguing about this stuff for too long, and it's better to just look at what to do in the case that it is just sort of, this is the way the world is. Oh, I'm an analytic philosopher, cryonics. I like continental philosophy, but I just am an analytic philosopher. So, yeah. I mean, I have a soft spot for Heidegger, but I haven't read enough continental philosophy to really make any claims about it. I mean, I'm analytic not exclusively by training, but mostly by most of it. Like I said, I took a class on Hegel in college. I took a class on Heidegger in college. I understood nothing of Hegel back then. I understand Hegel a little bit better now. Heidegger, I could grok a bit, so I do know something about that. Yeah, but like, mostly painfully analytic by training. Philosophy of science, philosophy of logic. It's like, yeah, so I know more about philosophy of language and the semantics than the ethics, though. Do you think the Chris McDaniel... Do you do the Chris McDaniel analytic Heidegger stuff? I've heard Chris McDaniel speak before. I have not actually gone into that stuff, though. I suspect I'd like it. Yeah, I don't remember it now because I looked at it many years ago and I wasn't like reading a ton of it. I think I actually read one of the like third paper or the second paper I read at the beginning of the pandemic at the start of Philosophy Roulette. Like Philosophy Roulette, like 2 or 3 is like Chris McDaniel. I was like, oh boy, Chris McDaniel paper. But it wasn't analytic Heidegger. Let me think. No, my Heidegger is pretty straight line like what Heidegger like there was a good Heidegger scholar at my school, so I took Heidegger with the Heidegger scholar. So it's not the Chris McDaniel stuff. I didn't learn the analytic Heidegger, but I probably would like it. But yeah. So yeah, we sat reading Being in Time like line by line as far as we get through it for most of the semester. Like, what does this like one line, then line 2. Lee Braver is interesting along those lines. I think, have I read anything by Lee Braver? I've also, there's another name I like pops up and I say, oh, I've probably seen something. You're analytic with the exception of Schopenhauer. Okay. Yeah, Schopenhauer's fun too. Wasn't Schopenhauer getting into a fight with Hegel? Yeah, the old story of like Schopenhauer versus Hegel, and everyone liked Hegel. And like Schopenhauer just kind of got kicked in the butt. Yeah, it'd be fun if I looked at that Chris McDaniel reminds me I should look at that stuff. Okay, you guys have anything else to say? I mean, I'm getting up 2 hours and 45 minutes on stream, and for this stuff that's kind of tiring. I mean, I could go on, but I'd just lose my mind. So that's yeah, well, most people in the US are analytics. There's like pockets of continental here in the US, but it's not the majority. So let's see. Yeah, nothing else to say right now. How to pull a metaphysical rabbit. Oh, God, annoying. Yeah, that's the story, Valpo, that Schopenhauer would lecture to empty rooms because Hegel would draw all the crowds. Yeah, see, I thought they were in like some sort of fight, so they scheduled, Schopenhauer scheduled his lectures at the same time, trying to piss off Hegel, and Hegel got all the students. Whoops. Okay, guys, so that's it for me for now, at least. I'm trying to do at least one philosophy stream a week. I've been doing one Minesweeper stream, one philosophy stream. I'm going to try to increase my numbers, but I've just been busy as of late, so I'm sorry it's not been more. But yeah, like I said earlier, anyone out there, you can join the Discord. I'm trying to be more proactive with the media stuff. You can join the Discord. You can join up on YouTube. If you have any questions, let me know. You can send, like, if you're in the Discord, you want to request me reading something, you can drop a line there, and I'll pay attention to it. Oh, thanks, Cryonics. And thank you, Valpo, for being here too, and everyone else being here, like Kuda and DeMarshall, everyone else. Baba Bloop, of course, friend of the stream. And that's it for now. So, have a good night. Everyone stay safe. And, got moral error theory. And that'll be it. I hope everyone has a good night and get some sleep. Oh, yeah, like 5. What was it? 5 or whatever. 5. Get some sleep if you're still awake. Alright, good night, all. I'll see you soon.